Kyle Bax is in Calgary. He's been looking into what's happening with WestJet and Air Canada, national airlines that in some ways, Kyle, are looking more and more regional all the time.
Yeah, Heather, the numbers are so important for this story. We looked at the data comparing the schedules of the two airlines right now compared to the same time in 2019. And it really shows this trend of WestJet focusing on the west and Air Canada on the east. For instance, Air Canada has dropped 9 direct flights out of Calgary towards Regina and Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, cities like Medicine Hat and Lethbridge, and in BC, cities like Nanaimo, Kamloops, and Victoria. Meanwhile, with WestJet, if you look at between Toronto and Montreal, that airline has reduced service by about 80%. So that's the trend that we're seeing. WestJet moving those resources from the east to focus on the prairies, and Air Canada reducing service mainly in the west and focusing on Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. And experts say part of the strategy here is to fend off competition.
The Canadian industry is growing by a number of players, but there is some moves afoot by the established carriers to kind of say, okay, we will create our own little fortresses and we'll manage those fortresses and we'll try to build our strengths around those fortresses. So that's what I've seen happen.
And recently we have seen new startup airlines like Lynx and Canada Jetlines, and some of the smaller carriers like Porter and Flair are expanding. And another consideration is just financial. During the pandemic, obviously this industry was hit very hard. Airlines are trying to keep their costs in check. And even right now, as the industry is still recovering, there's still a lot of debt to pay off, and these airlines are trying to make sure that they can be profitable. And so that's why they're focusing on some of these key areas.
What does it mean, though, Kyle, this shift for travelers in terms of where they can go, how much they'll pay?
And it really depends on where you live and where you're flying. If let's say you're flying from Toronto to Calgary, not only the main carriers, but these new startups, these smaller airlines, they're flying on those routes. So there is quite a bit of competition that keeps prices in check. But some of these smaller cities, they're losing their service, they're seeing cuts. And a lot of the smaller airlines aren't flying to these smaller cities. And so that's where there's a lot of concern. We recently had the Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce asking the federal regulator to look at basically possible collusion between WestJet and Air Canada, because they're seeing this shift, Air Canada focusing on the east and WestJet focusing on the west. These airlines, basically saying as they're rebuilding, they're having to be very diligent with their resources. But really, this is an industry that's seeing a lot of, basically it's in a state of flux right now. And experts say these shifts in schedules, these cuts that we're seeing, it could just be temporary. It really depends what we see over the next few years in terms of the finances of the sector and whether we could see, possible consolidation in the sector as well.
An interesting trend. Thank you for bringing it to us today, Kyle. Kyle Bax is in Calgary.